Mormon Stories podcast depends entirely upon the voluntary contributions of you, its listeners. To keep Mormon Stories alive, please consider donating today at mormonstories.org. To make a contribution to Mormon Stories, just click on the Make a Donation button at the top right of the mormonstories.org website. For all this and more, please check out mormonstories.org. And thank you for listening. Welcome to part 2 of our multi-part interview with Dr. Richard Bushman, author of Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. I want to begin with a bit of a disclaimer. Some of you will notice that the audio quality on these two interviews have not quite been up to par, and I wanted to briefly explain why. Brother Bushman was a real gem to conduct this interview while fighting a cold, but because his voice was a bit weakened, I had to turn his volume up very high to make sure his points were heard. As a result, you will hear a continual buzz throughout the interview, although it's somewhat slight, and some heavy static for the first 2 minutes or so of the interview. Please forgive the annoyance, but I felt that his points were so important that I could not bear to edit them out. After the first 2 minutes or so, it becomes much more bearable. Now to the content. In this episode, we tackle 4 main topics. First, Brother Bushman provides a high-level review of the major Joseph Smith biographies that preceded Rough Stone Rolling, including Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. Next, Brother Bushman discusses the art of writing history and the challenges involved in trying to arrive at, quote, the facts and, quote, the truth for both historians and readers of history. Finally, we discuss in depth the first 2 of our top 10 tough Joseph Smith issues, the first being the multiple accounts of Joseph Smith's first vision story, and second, Joseph Smith's involvement in folk magic and treasure digging. Joseph Smith's story and your story today on Mormon Stories.
Well, there are interesting and valuable biographies in their own way, starting with George Buchanan, who wrote a very idealized picture of Joseph Smith in the 19th century. But one of our eminent intellectuals of that period, and I didn't consult it for information, but I think it sort of stands in the historiographical sequence. John Henry Evans' biography was the book that more than any other turned Leonard Arrington towards church history, because Evans, he did it all with writing style, with his prose. He was just as laudatory as Cannon, but he wrote it in kind of a down-to-earth journalistic language that made it sound like Joseph Smith is a real guy who happened to have a lot of virtues and talents, and so it was an appealing book. Woodbridge Riley, at the turn of the century, wrote his psychological portrait of Joseph Smith, this is Yale PhD, and it really laid out the arguments, the anti-Masonry, anti-Catholicism arguments that Fawn Brody picked up on later. It was marred by its unrelenting sarcastic tone. He was just scornful from first word to last. But he actually had a lot to say, and so it has to go on the list. And then, of course, Fawn Brody, which I'm now beginning to see could be thought of as a positive work. Mormons couldn't stand it, of course. But in terms of non-Mormon books written about Joseph Smith, it was a relatively sympathetic portrait. I still have friends who say they think it's a very sympathetic portrait of Joseph Smith. And of course, Mormons are mystified by how anyone could say that.
I see what you're saying. I left No Man Knows My History thinking that he was brilliant, that he was a genius and a good-hearted man.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I wanted to say. The final book I'd put on the list would be Dawn of Hill, which I thought was a lot of historical substance there because Marvin Hill, her brother, was helping her, and a nicely written piece, but not much on Joseph's thought. And through it all, that was what I felt was missing, was his religious life and his theological mind. And so finally I decided that's why I needed to write a book that would fill out that side of his character.
So you're a humble man, so you're not going to grasp this, but were you hoping to write the definitive biography, or is that just a silly word altogether?
It's a silly word. No one can ever define Joseph Smith permanently. I was very conscious that this is just one view of Joseph. And someone can go through and tell another story entirely. So, but I wanted it to be a view that would explain why so many really substantive people joined the church and continue to believe in Joseph Smith. The great dilemma in writing about Joseph Smith is that if you start with the gold plates and end with polygamy, he really comes across as a scalawag and a fraud. But then you got the problem of why do so many people believe in him? And, substantive, sensible people like Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff. And then why do they still believe today? So I wanted to be able to tell the story that would deal with all the facts, but would write it empathetically so that you could see the world from Joseph Smith and the Mormons' point of view. But that's just one angle. There are lots of other ways of telling that story.
So this presents a bit of an interesting dilemma, because I agree, just focusing on the negative not only doesn't tell the full story, but it also comes across as being negative. But as I talked to you beforehand about how we might approach this podcast, I set it up from my own experience, and I'll just recount that because it sort of sets up how we're going to approach this podcast. But basically, I grew up with a whitewashed view of Joseph Smith, and I have to admit I didn't have parents who could school me in the nuances of history and of perspective and of depth. They're wonderful, smart people, but we just didn't have those types of conversations growing up really about the church or church history. So I had to rely not on what I read, because I didn't read much. So I relied on what my seminary teacher taught me and what my Sunday school teachers taught me. And I happened to have a seminary teacher who grew up in Salt Lake and was a Bruce R. McConkie / Joseph Fielding Smith Mormon, if there ever was one. And so I didn't have any subtle, nuanced perceptions of Joseph Smith at all. And I just have to be honest. I think that people who are growing up in the church today, who rely on the church education system and general conference talks and ensign articles, or even New Era Friend articles about Joseph Smith as their primary forms of input, get the same sort of perspective that I did, which is, here's this wonderful boy who was courageous and didn't drink alcohol when there was surgery happening to him, and he cared about God at a young age and prayed and had this miracle, and then for the rest of his life built this church and was always being thrown in jail for his spiritual views, and he was always being persecuted for his spiritual strength and wisdom, to the point where he was ultimately martyred. That's the view I have of Joseph Smith. And of course it's a silly, infantile view, but I got to age at least 25 with that view, somehow, while still getting almost a 4.0 BYU. So I don't think I was a dummy. But there are just so many thousands and thousands of people today, every day on the internet, who grew up with a view like that, and then they're confronted with Font Brody or xmormon.org or some website, and it just blows them apart because they can't deal with it. And so, while you and I discussed with time limiting whether we should sort of try and do a balanced podcast where we talk about the good and bad, or whether time would be best served by just attacking the tough issues, we decided that we were just going to tackle the tough issues head on. And so if there's time and we end up wanting to, we can come back at the end and do some of the more inspirational, uplifting stuff. But I'm just going to ask my listeners to bear with us as we try and optimize this podcast for a certain audience, which is those who are shocked and disturbed by a lot of what they have read, either through Grant Palmer or Michael Quinn or Fawn Brody or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the context that I was hoping to have this conversation around. And so I picked... Oh, did you want to throw something in before I launch?
Well, I would just say that I concur in your judgment that this is a major problem. I run into this all the time. And the trouble is you're not just shocked by the new facts you learned, but you begin to question the whole teaching structure. You wonder why you were so deceived, and so it casts a shadow back on your teachers and everyone who runs the church. So somehow or other we've got to give people growing up the whole story, or they're going to be in a precarious position. Because who knows when they'll go out on the internet sometime and get hit with all this stuff.
So you do have people coming to you a lot?
A lot.
How does that happen?
Oh, they just write me and tell me a story like you. You know, they've read the book and it's a problem for them. They feel relieved. They feel like the book helps them out a little bit.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So with that, I've picked 10 or 11 issues just to tackle. And what I'm going to do is try and set up for you what the traditional perceptions are, have you validate where the facts, add the facts that tell the full story or the full story that we can tell, so that we really know, instead of what the stereotyped, whitewashed view is, what the facts or the historical facts seem to demonstrate. And then we'll have a discussion on, you helping us understand how you might put these issues in historical context, how you might put them in spiritual context, and if there's any debunking that needs to happen where there's a typical anti-Mormon claim or position and it's just flat out incorrect. Maybe you can inform us of that as well. Is that fair?
Well, let me begin by talking about the facts.
Yes, please.
We sometimes think like, these are little nuggets like marbles. They're just there, irreducible. But, in any given letter, there are a million facts. And facts only become significant when they are turned into evidence. And they become evidence when there is a perspective or a theory or an idea that makes those facts relevant. Then they become evident. And the reason I stress that is that what we think are just compelling facts, they just demand, also have underlying them a perspective on Joseph Smith that ties those facts together into some scheme. And until we recognize that whoever is telling us these facts is selectively choosing out of the millions and millions and millions of little facts the ones that he or she wants to tell his particular story. So it isn't just a matter of controverting the facts, it's identifying the story that's being told and asking, is there another story that can contain those facts that ends up being a different picture?
Right. Yeah, and there's the whole discussion about history being subjective and people having agendas and never having the complete set of facts to then, base your conclusions upon.
Yeah, and you can't just dismiss that and say, oh, well, that's what people try to do to escape. That is the reality. That is the reality that historians work with every day of their lives. We all know we're molding our stories to portray the world or the past in the way we want to do it. And so, in a way, what you choose as your facts or what you choose to emphasize and the sequence you put them in is a reflection of you. You can't just say it's the facts compel me to think some way. You are making a choice about how you want to view the world. And I'm just sorry, but we have to begin with that realization.
Yes, and thank you for that. And Do you have, as a teacher of history, do you have an anecdote, and this is putting you on the spot, do you have an anecdote that illustrates this concept in terms of how, in a way that something may have been written and then it got rewritten, or a way something was told, that sort of illustrates how precarious history by its nature can be?
Well, I wrote an essay years ago called Faithful History, where I told a couple of anecdotes. One was about the way the Constitution is interpreted, how it was turned from a noble document of high political ideals into an expression of the base pecuniary interests of the framers, namely wanting a government that could protect their investments in the national debt. And Charles Beard just flipped the whole country with his book on the economic origins of the Constitution, because he sort of brought out this stuff. It didn't last. Someone qualified this, and a different picture emerged, but he just turned us over that way. But the story I told, to sort of make it more simple, was if you tell the story of a woman dying, and then you say she died after her lover had gone to war and had been killed, and then you say, then she died. You say, oh, poor woman, she died of a broken heart. And then you add in the fact that she also smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Then suddenly, everything takes a different look. So you have to be ready for the whole world to be turned upside down when a new sequence of facts is thrown into the picture.
So just the selection and sequence of facts. And the audio was a little bit low, so I'm just going to repeat that. So you say a woman died, right?
A woman dies, and then you say, well, why did she die? And then you say, her husband was killed in the war. Oh, she died of a broken heart. Then you add in the fact that she was smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. You get a different view of it entirely.
Right.
And I think that, you can tell 100 stories of that sort. The one I often tell is, what if in one of these reality shows you allowed a television cameraman to come in and film you day and night? And at a certain point, they went through and they pulled out all the points where the mother in the family was scolding her baby, her child, maybe spanking it or getting angry at it. And over, 6 months, there might be 10 or 15 of them. And you said, this is how this woman treats her child. You say, my God, she's an abusive mother. But there's no picture of her sitting on the couch with the baby pulled up against her, snuggled into under her arm, reading a book. No kissing the baby as it goes to bed. And all of a sudden, you've turned probably a pretty good mother into a horrible tyrant.
Right. And so someone could say to a church leader, for example, well, you clearly don't know the full story, or you're not telling the full story, and the church leader could turn back on the disgruntled person and say, well, you don't either, and you're not either.
Yeah, that's all I'm saying. And I'm not saying that you can ever demonstrate thoroughly which is the truth. You just always have to realize that this is a story that's being told. And say, all right, that's your story, but I can tell it a different way. There are too many of these people. I met some in Berlin this summer, and they'd run onto this stuff. They had Grant Palmer's book, and they were just wiped out by it. They thought, it's all over. And it reminded me of that famous picture of the beautiful lady and the hag. You look at it at one moment, and it's a gorgeous woman with an ostrich feather hat. You look at it another moment, and it's a horrible hag staring out at you. Unfortunately, history is that way. It can take many forms.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you for providing that sort of overview of the animal that we call history. Let's jump into the first issue, and that's the first vision. And I'll set you up so you can hit the ball out of the park, so to speak. I didn't learn until well after I graduated from college that there was anything other than one version of the Joseph Smith story. That Joseph was, that there was a lot of revivals when he was young. There was some confusion in his family about religion, that he attended these revivals and didn't know which church to join. It's sort of the little Joseph Smith movie that we all grew up watching. And then when he's 14, a sincere boy goes to pray, and he has a vision, and God the Father and Jesus appear to him as two distinct beings. I should mention that before the appearance, that some evil spirit attacks him, but he sees God and Jesus, and they tell him that none of the churches are true, and that he's to start his own. So, that's what I learned growing up. Tell us how that doesn't necessarily paint a complete picture.
Well, I think the heart of this problem has to do with the variations in these two major accounts, 1832 and 1838. Then there's some other less complete accounts along the way. But what throws people for a loop is exemplified by, he says Lord as if it were a singular being in the 1830 account, and the Father and the Son in the 1838. Actually, there are many differences. That's just one in those two accounts.
What are some of the others? Just so, because
well, for example,
a lot
as
of
you
this.
say,
Go ahead.
There's no account of Satan overpowering him in the first account, the 1832. 1832 emphasizes he went to seek forgiveness, and the first words that were told him is, "You are forgiven." In 1838, forgiveness doesn't figure into it at all. And so it goes down the line.
And in the 1832 version, it says, "The Lord appeared to me," not God and Jesus appeared to me.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
that's the one that usually jumps out at most Mormons. I find this problem perplexing in this way. For some people, this is a huge issue. He couldn't tell the story right. How could he vary on such a significant item as who actually appeared to him, and so on? Other people say, look, whenever we tell a story, second time, we always tell it differently, different details spring forth into our minds, and so on. So they just can't even get excited about the problem. So I don't know what to do about that. But there are two things I have to say. One is the 1832 account really has a different purpose. It is a very naive account. The sentences run on to one another. They're all compressed. The spelling is poor. It's sort of jumpy. It really is a naive story. It's sort of Joseph sort of unfolding what happened to him. The 1838 account really is laying down the foundation for the organization of the church, really saying this is how it all got started. And so the emphasis is very much on none of the churches are true. Therefore, a new church has to be established. In the first account, there's not much emphasis on that. Joseph is told that people are wicked, but all sorts of millennialists knew the world was wicked. You didn't have a sense of this institutional corruption that everything in the religious world had decayed. So I see them as really having quite different purposes from beginning to end. That's one thing I have to say. The second thing is, for me, it's a great mystery why Joseph is so reluctant to talk about his visions. I don't think he ever told Lucy or Joseph Sr. about the first vision. He explicitly says, when she asked him, he said, "Never mind, I'm well enough off. I've learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true." And it's not until Moroni commands him that he tells the family about the visit of Moroni and the gold plates. And then he doesn't put the visit of John the Baptist into the church history until 1838. Doesn't make that part of the standard story. and never writes down the visit of Peter, James, and John. The 1836 revelation in the Kirtland Temple, he had Warren Parrish write it into his journal, but so far as can be told, he didn't tell anyone else about it in all of Kirtland. And I had no way of explaining that. He's very concerned to publish immediately his written revelations, the ones that are coming by the Holy Spirit. He collects them, he edits them, he sends them off to the press. He says they're the foundation of the church. But the visions, the visual presentations, are just not part of that story. Section 76 being the one example, with the one exception. So the way I see it is that he's holding back on these visionary experiences. He never publishes that 1832 thing. I don't think we found it until the 1960s sometime. So I don't know what that means, but I'm not all that surprised that the detailed version of things varies when he's so reluctant to tell that whole story of the visions anyway.
So it's almost like maybe he was humble about it or felt it was sacred and didn't want to go about just really harping on it. I
think so. I think he also was burned by that Methodist minister who told him it was all hogwash. And, you know, there is a visionary culture. If you read certain chapters of my book, you'll know that there are a lot of people who claim to be receiving revelations. And I think he thought they were kind of kooks. And, you know, he's not really sympathetic to these extreme emotional expressions of spirituality. And I think he sort of felt like he didn't want to be associated with that visionary culture. But that's all speculation. I don't really know what's in his mind.
So is there any evidence that he told his family about the first vision prior to 1830?
I don't think so. There is, in section 20, there's a very slight reference to, in the 5th verse, to the time when this elder was received a forgiveness of his sins, when he's sort of recounting the major experiences. So he's making oblique references, but I don't think that first vision story was really known by many people at all until the mid-30s and not really publicized till 1840.
And that's something that our listeners are probably going to be really stunned about, because now you can't do the first missionary discussion without the Joseph Smith story. But it sounds like many of the converts of the early church, the fact that Joseph had seen God and Jesus didn't even enter in to their conversion.
I think it's almost certain it did not enter into their conversions until later. It's not absolutely certain they would have known the name of Joseph Smith. He was not presented as the key figure in those first 5 or 6 years. The revelation was always in the passive voice. Revelation has been received, or God is speaking to his people. But as a personality or a significant figure, there's no evidence they even talked about it. Parley Pratt writes The Voice of Warning in 1837. He never mentions Joseph Smith's name, and he doesn't even mention Revelation until something like page 122. So they were able to preach the gospel without doing much with the stories that for us now are the central part of the history.
So what was the call? If it wasn't Joseph Smith has seen God and has been told to start a new church, what was the call for people to convert to Mormonism?
It was fundamentally the restoration of the spiritual gifts and the building of the city of Zion and a gathering in preparation for the second coming in a place of refuge. They would teach all sorts of other things, just simple gospel principles. They were sent forth, to preach repentance to the people. They were not sent forth to teach Joseph Smith. In 1832, Joseph Smith writes an article for a newspaper, which he tries to summarize their beliefs. Doesn't say anything about himself as a visionary, but talks about gathering in a city of Zion, preparation for the last days.
So it's just basically have faith and preach nothing but faith, repentance, and baptism to these people the kingdom of God is at hand. You need to
Right.
follow Christ and come do it in Kirtland.
Right, or Missouri.
Or
And the key thing is the restoration of gifts. Revelations are now coming. Spiritual gifts are coming. It's Mark, 16 something or other. 16, I guess. And that was an issue that was on people's mind. Everyone wants to go back to the primitive church, but they knew they didn't have the gifts of the primitive church. And Mormons say, we do have the gifts, we do have healings, and so on.
Okay. And so people like Grant Palmer like to paint the picture in this way. And even Fawn Brody, I think, did this. It's sort of like the Smiths were poor in the 1820s. Joseph Smith was always concocting these schemes. He decided that he was going to write a book because maybe he could make money off the book. And so, however he wrote this book called the Book of Mormon. Originally, with the 116 pages, it was going to be more of a kind of